I'd like to take a minute to talk about one of our sponsors, Parker Sporlan and thermostatic expansion valves. How can you guys always have the right thermostatic expansion valve for the right application without having to carry hundreds of valves in your truck? Well, that's simple. Using Sporlan's interchangeable cartridge style valves. The Q valve for conventional and the BQ valve for balance port. It's as easy as one, two, three. It serves thousands of unique applications. So, one, you just select the thermostatic element for your application. Two, you select the body style you need. Three, you select the right size cartridge for the application. These easy to select and assemble valves mean you always have the right valve for the job on your truck. For more information on the Q and BQ valves, visit sporlan.com. Thanks, guys. Enjoy the episode.
We've all been there, in the middle of a job, everything going smoothly, until boom, you're missing a part. United Refrigeration is your one-stop shop for all your refrigeration needs. Use your computer or smartphone to go to www.uri.com at any time of the day or night to check stock on your favorite brands, such as Copeland, Sporlan, Carlisle Compressors, Danfoss, Emerson CPC boards and sensors, Carrel, Hussmann Parts, and K2Therm. United Refrigeration Inc. is home to these brands and many more. Looking for information on refrigerant conversions or refrigerant banking? Quick access links on the homepage can get you to the information you need. All approved accounts are able to see live to-the-minute inventory and pricing. Product not in stock at your local branch? No problem. Use the Nearby Stock feature to find a local branch that does have what you need. Are you looking for a branch address, phone number, or after-hours number? That's all available as well. Just click on the branch locator and search for your local branch. Have a model number and looking for a replacement part? www.uri.com/ARP has a vast list of quick pick replacement parts. Just search for the model number of the equipment you're working on and click the Replacement Parts tab. If you don't have an account, click the Register button and we'll have you online in no time. With more than 400 locations in North America, each United Refrigeration branch is fully stocked for immediate pickup. Our branch employees have in-depth technical knowledge, so we can help you get what you need when you need it. Visit your local store or www.uri.com/ARP today. United Refrigeration Inc. has all your solutions down cold.
I suffer from anxiety and depression. How do those two energies go together? Like, ah,
Oh,
ah,
oh,
I'm afraid of the future.
I regret the past.
How did this happen?
I blame myself.
I need to face my fear.
I gotta lay down.
You're just like him now.
No, that's why. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. You're here with your hosts, Brett Wetzel and Kevin Compass. No, I'm not like him. Shut up. So, where are you at this week, man?
I am in the wonderful state of Michigan, south of Detroit, doing a controls changeover
Sounds fun.
by myself.
Sounds fun. What are you going from what to what?
CPC to microthermal, probably the oldest CPC I've ever seen, besides like the original. Like I've never seen 10 relay RO.
Say that again?
Like the stores got like 10 relay RO boards. Like I've never even seen them. I mean that's how old they are.
Are they like
Like
the echelon
there
ones?
is physically 10 relay. No, they're 485.
No,
But
because I
I
know
mean, it
for a
is
while. For a while there, they made the echelon relay outs, analog inputs, and then the ESRs.
Yeah, this is older than that. Like this is like one of the original versions of the RMC.
Gotcha.
It is old.
How much longer you got? You got all week?
Yeah, I'll be down here the rest of the week. I got to be out of here on Friday, no matter what. But I'm probably gonna have to go back down a day or two to finish up. It's because I was by myself, so I mean, plus the rack was in pretty rough shape. So I mean, it had an RMC in it, so I mean, it was like 26 years old. The rack's almost as old. The rack's probably almost as old as me.
Beautiful. I'm in California.
I said it's warm here too, and back home, unfortunately.
Oh,
But
really?
yeah, I'm stuck out of town.
It iced back in Texas, but not as bad as what it was when I was in Vegas.
Yeah, no bueno on that. So this week, guys, I think we're gonna go over how to do a Glycol Startup and how to bleed air out of systems and some like basic Glycol troubleshooting. So we'll dive right on into it, guys. So when doing a Glycol Startup, you got a couple more things to take into account before you go ahead and do this. So you want to get your glycol in there before you start charging the racks. And you want to make sure the glycol system's all ready to go before you start doing anything. So before we do anything, we're going to do what they call a pre-purge. So we are going to take water and we're going to fill the system up with tap water. Not a big fan of doing this, but I mean, almost every customer requires it. We're going to take the water, fill it up, and then we're going to run the pumps for a couple hours. I usually go like 4 or 5 hours. Some of them call for it to be a day. I mean, whatever the customer spec is, but usually 4 or 5 hours is enough. You let everything run through, and then you do two things when you do this. You find all your leaks you missed that you pressurized and missed or whatever. Find your leaks with the water in it because it's a lot easier to drain water down than it is glycol. And then you want to, rinse out all the, brazed debris, rocks, whatever's in the lines. I mean, you're using L pipe copper, so I mean it's not ACR, so it's usually not capped. So you want to do the pre-flush to find all the leaks, and you want to also just make sure everything's cleaned out of the system. And then you're going to drain that down. You're going to completely drain the system from all the low points. You're going to try to get as much out as you can. I generally, when I do this, I will hook an air compressor up to it and I will pressurize the supply and push everything out the returns. So that way I can push as much water out as I can, because the goal is here, you want to get all that water out as you can. The reason I don't like doing this is because you're putting water in the system no matter what, and it's untreated. And depending on how hard the water is, now you have a bunch of minerals in there, and it could lead to scaling issues later. So that's a big reason I'm not a big fan of it. But in the same sense, you had to kind of follow their guide, and you want to try to get as much of the crap out as you can. To be honest, I never really see the water dirty, but it's more so for me to like make sure there's no leaks and everything else is good with the system. So after you drain everything down, or while it's draining down, you're going to want to tear the pumps apart. You want to tear the on the inlet to the pump, you're going to have a startup. They call it a construction screen. It's a real fine mesh screen. You're going to want to take that fine mesh screen out and just leave the big screen in. And then what you're going to do is you're going to shut the pumps back up. You're going to fill them back with water, make sure you got no leaks after you put the strainers back in. And you're going to discard the construction strainers, and then you're going to let everything drain. Now, after you let everything drain for a couple hours, it may take a couple hours, and you pressurize it and like get everything out of there. You drain all the coils. You want to try to hit the lowest point. Usually the cases are the easiest to hit the lowest point. So you want to drain from the cases and from the rack. Just make sure you guys actually put some drain points in, and then you're going to want to get some air in the loop. So you're going to want to either take a bleeder or two off in the store, or get some air in there so that way it drains properly. So once you get all the water out of it, after that, you're going to start the glycol charging phase. So this is where I'll take like multiple pumps, 1 horsepower pumps, 3/4 horsepower pumps, and I'll put the barrels, it'll come 4 barrels on a skid, and I'll put 1 on the supply, 1 on the return, and 1 on the warm fluid header if it has it. And then I will force all the glycol solenoids open, whether I have to do it with a magnet or if I do it on the controller, and I will start charging this. Usually you lose the warm fluid tanks first, meaning like you're going to end up deadheading that first, but at least you can get a couple in there. And then you're just going to keep charging it until you get the static pressure up to like 20, 25 pounds on the system. And you keep going, then you're going to pump the pumps and let all the air go for a couple minutes. And then you're going to keep charging till you keep that static number up, and then just keep charging with glycol, getting all your barrels in. It usually goes pretty quick if you have a good setup. I usually take a 7/8 piece of copper, shoot a 90 on it, cut a 45 on the end, and I put a ball valve on it, and I use that to drop down the tanks so I can get it all the way down to the bottom. And then I could just shut the ball valve off and move from tank to tank real quick. I mean, we could usually put 1,000 gallons of glycol in about 3 hours, maybe a little less, depending on if we have some decent pumps or if we had to go to like, Farm and Fleet and grab some like crap pumps. But it usually goes pretty quick. So as you're doing this, you want to keep bumping the pumps. The reason you want to keep bumping the pumps is you want to move around that glycol and push the air pockets out. So you want to push the air pockets back towards the bleeder and back towards the air separator in the mechanical room, because on the return to the pumps, you're going to have what they call an air separator. It's basically like a centrifugal separator, basically like an oil separator, and it causes the air to scoop up towards the top of the top of the air separator, and you're going to have a bleeder up there, and that's going to be your main bleeder. But if your rack room is on the ground, it's not going to be your best place to bleed, because remember, you want to bleed, air is always going to get stuck in the highest point. So you want to put bleeders all over the store. Like if you're putting in a new glycol store and you're not putting bleeders on the mains and bleeders on the tops of the risers, you're only screwing yourself on startup, because it costs 10 times more to bleed that store than it's going to cost for those bleeders later on. So after I get them, everything bled and everything looks good, then I'll start bumping the pumps. And generally what I'll do is I'll overcharge the system. I want to back up because I forgot one thing. Before you start charging with glycol, make sure you set the air bladder. So you want to do it with no pressure in there, and you want to check the air on the tank, and you want to set it to how many feet basically how many feet ahead you have. And generally, most of the time, if the rack's on a roof, it's usually 22 is good for like a Walmart. 18 to 22 is pretty good for a Costco on the ground. It just depends. A lot of them it's in the spec. It's a customer spec. But if you do have a really high rise, you're going to have to set that expansion tank bladder higher. So you means you're going to have to pump it up with a bicycle pump or a little air compressor. So just be aware of that. Make sure you check it. Generally, the last couple of racks I've come out, they've come out at like 20 pounds. So like they're good. But I just check them with static in there, no glycol, no water. That way you could just check the pressure on the bladder of the tank. And that being said, if you push on that Schrader and water vapor comes out, the tank's ruptured. I've had like 2 of them on startup so far that when I went to go check them, they had no air in them, and they just had water flow out of them. So the tank was ruptured. So good thing we got it before we put glycol in, because it was a pain in the ass and there was no ball valve. So we were able to add a ball valve and start charging the system with glycol, and then change the tank out later on with the ball valve. Just be aware of that, guys. And then same thing for, filling and draining. Make sure you guys put Silcox in cases. And if you've got to cut 1 or 2 Silcox in on a case, so you have an actual full size 3/4 inch drain, do it. It's going to be way worth it. $40 it costs to do 2 drains on the supply and return than what it's going to cost you if you guys got to drain down the system later. If you've got to drain down the system later, you main, and there's nothing in the store, you're going to be draining for hours. So it's going to cost you guys a ton of labor, and a ton of materials. By the time you guys get it, glycol is expensive. So just add drains down at the cases so that way you could drain them in there. Just make sure you put locking caps on there, because we did have a store where the department was washing the case with the glycol.
What, they
So
actually hook the hose? They hook the hose up to the glycol?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So we had random, like the stores kept going down randomly. Like it just kept going down. We kept losing glycol pressure randomly. It'd be fine for like a week and a half. And then on Tuesdays, it would just dive to the point where the rack would shut.
They don't use dye, so they thought it was actually water.
Dye, so they thought it was water.
Amazing.
Yes. It happened for like 3 weeks in a row before like we finally caught it. And I was in there early enough, and because it happened the same time every day almost. So like I got there at that time, and sure as shit, they're washing the meat cases.
All right, I wanted to touch on the expansion tank real quick. So one of the things you could do if you find that someone's been adding glycol, that's one of the things that will happen. The pressure on the suction will actually seem low if you lose your pressure in your tank. If you tap on it with a wrench, it should sound hollow. If it doesn't, if it sounds solid, then basically you have glycol in there. It could be just the bladder had lost its charge from the fitting at the top, or it could have been that the thing had ruptured and now you have glycol in there. One thing, if you press on the top, and like you said, if you have glycol come out, then that the thing is ruptured. The other test that you can do is if it loses its charge, where you have to recharge it. There's usually an Apollo valve there, essentially a water valve there. And right before that, in between the tank and that ball valve, there's typically an angled 1/4-inch valve. If you were to hook a line up to there, that would be glycol and all the glycol that's in the tank. And what you can do is actually pressurize it with nitrogen while you're having that fitting on there, putting it back in the fill tank. So in this way, once it does empty out with glycol, and it should just be nothing. You shouldn't have any air coming out of it. If you do have nitrogen coming out of it, that's indicative that you actually have a leak. So I just wanted to bring that up in case anyone wanted to know how to see if what side is ruptured and what have you.
Yeah, I mean that's a good test. I always check it during startup because it'll really play hell with the system when you're doing it. So after you get everything rolling, I usually overcharge the glycol, meaning like I'll get my return pressure up to like 30 pounds, my supply pressure up real high, just under what the relief would be. The reason I do this is usually I leave it running the night before to bleed the system. So we usually put bleeders all over the store. And what we're doing is, and I bump it up before I leave, make sure it's at like 20 pounds, 25 pounds before I leave. Bump the pressure up real high because I'm going to let it bleed while I'm, we're at dinner or whatever. And maybe if I come back from dinner, I'll just, pop in the store real quick and check on it, make sure it's good. And then I let it bleed all night. And then in the morning, I come into a system that's like 99% bled. So I, could start, easily. Now, there is a way to bleed this that speeds up the process. So what I do is generally on the top of the air separator, just about every manufacturer I've seen has done this. So on the top of the air separator, you have a T basically, and the top of the T goes to the vent valve, the auto vent, and then the side of the T comes off and goes to the to a ball valve, basically a 3/4-inch ball valve with the hose cock on there. So what I do is, so that gives you full flow out of there. What I do is I close one of the supplies. Okay. I force everything through the one supply. And then what I do is I close one of the returns. I take the 1 second. I take the hose, I throw it in a tank. No, it's a supply I close. I'm sorry. I'm like half asleep. I'm working like 16-hour days. I close the supply and on one of the loops. And what I do is I force the glycol through the one supply. And then I drain the air separator at the top into the tank. Now, what this is going to do is it's going to cause the pumps to start pulling a vacuum. Just about pulling a vacuum. And what you do is on the bottom of the fill tank, it's piped into one of the pumps. You want to make sure that pump is running. So it's constantly sucking out the glycol you're putting in. So what it's doing is it's forcing all that pressure into that one loop, and it's forcing that loop to fill 100%. And then it's forcing all that air back onto the suction side of the other on that loop, and it's causing the pumps to pull in a vacuum for a second. Not really cavitating that long. I usually do that for like 20 minutes. I mean, it'll purge the living crap out of the system, though. I mean, you'll get more air out doing that than you will, in a couple hours of it just running.
So you said you let the pumps run for how long like that?
Probably like a half hour or so.
Oh, wow.
I mean, they're not really cavitating. I mean, it's just pulling in enough where it'll pull the glycol back in.
Gotcha. Now, you were saying with the pumps, what kind of pumps you guys using typically if you're not going to the farm supply or whatever?
Granger makes a decent one. What is it? At my last shop, we had this pump called the Overdore for 5,000. That was legitimately its name. This is probably the best glycol pump I've ever seen. So it would pump 100% pure glycol, or it's like 95%, whatever the pure glycol is.
Yeah.
It would pump that shit up 3 stories and across the roof into a system.
Oh, wow.
It would do a barrel in like 6.5 minutes of pure glycol.
Wow.
And that's with you had to throttle a bypass on it because we never bought hoses that would handle it because the pump charge would get so high. But it would probably do a barrel in about 4 minutes with the proper hoses. I mean, we spent a lot of money on this, but I mean, we had a bunch of Walmarts with a bunch of glycol condensing towers that constantly blew loops. So we were constantly putting glycol in. So it paid for itself in no time. I think we paid like $2,000 for this pump, but I mean, it paid for itself in no time. When you could put 1,000 gallons of glycol in less than a half hour, I mean, that's just money in the bank right there.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, 2 startups it's paid for. But yeah, like generally the Dayton pumps are okay. The Milwaukee pump does okay too. Till you start getting some pressure on there. Then, I mean, I probably got like 100 gallons of glycol out with my Milwaukee pump on a 12 amp hour battery.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's what I generally use for service stuff. I use the Milwaukee pump.
Yeah.
And then, but yeah, I generally just use some like crap disposable like pumps we pay $100 for because I usually end up burning them up by the end of the job.
Today's episode is sponsored by the new Reefer Shield differential pressure monitor from Westermeyer Industries. When the filter element of your coalescing oil separator is contaminated, it can hurt your system's performance and efficiency. But how do you know when it's time to replace that filter? Wait too long to replace and you could end up with a nasty filter blowout. But replacing too often can be a waste of time and money. The answer is installing a differential pressure monitor. The new Reefer Shield RDP-01 differential pressure monitor is available now from Westermeyer Industries. To find out more information, email sales@westermeyerind.com. That's sales@westermeyerind.com. Oh yeah, because they're made for water, not glycol. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll be lucky. Like with the ones from Farm and Fleet, you'll be lucky if you make it through, I don't know, 3 skids without blowing a seal out and it's just pissing glycol everywhere.
Oh wow.
I mean, yeah, and I just let it drain back into one of the tanks. I just drill a hole in the top and let it drain back into one of the tanks. But it's like every time, like it ends up blowing the pump seal. They're just not made for it.
Yeah. Made for moving water for cattle. That's about it.
Yeah. Yeah, so generally I'll do that. So once I get the glycol in there, then I will start charging everything. I usually throw a static charge in there, but what you want to be very cautious of is you either want to get the refrigerant in there before you put the water in to do the flush, or you want to wait till you have the glycol in there circulating before you start charging. The reason this is you could very easily crack one of the braze plate heat exchangers. So that's one thing you want to be very cautious of. You want to make sure you have proper flow. You want to make sure you have good flow. You got all the air blood out of the rack, because when you start charging this, I mean, you're going to be going into your liquid line. Yeah, you're not giving a full liquid, but you're going to be charging through the liquid line and pumping it down into the rack. So as you're doing this, I mean, you want to make sure you have full flow. You want to make sure your flow switches work. You want to make sure your delta pressures is good. I mean, whatever the store calls for, if it's 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 20 pounds, you want to make sure that's all good. And then you want to start charging the rack. Generally, what I'll do is I'll just watch it. You'd be surprised how fast it'll drop the glycol when you're charging it. So just keep an eye on there and make sure you're not going to be going below your free stats. If your free stats are set, check them. Make sure they're set for, most of the time it's 13 degrees. Make sure you're not going below 13 degrees. And if you are, stop charging and, shut the rack down, let everything warm up, let the refrigerant pressure come up. So the SST comes up, and then the chillers will warm up a little bit. You don't want to frost over a plate frame heat exchanger. I mean, you want to make sure everything's good. And then
why? What'll happen if you frost it over?
I mean, you hope it doesn't crack, but it'll definitely stop flow. It'll hinder flow until it does crack.
That's why in the EPA book, it tells you, like, when you're recovering refrigerant out of a chiller, they want you to put the water running. Same principle, because if you're pulling and reclaiming that gas or liquid out of there, it's basically a drop in temperature and start freezing up.
Yeah, that's another thing. So when you guys are, shutting down a chiller or something, or doing some work on a chiller or a braze plate heat exchanger, this goes for condensers also. So just be, aware, like when you're recovering the gas or your liquid out of there, once you get below freezing, get below 32 degrees. If it's straight water, when you get to like 35 degrees saturation on your gauges when you're recovering, you're going to want to stop and see if it starts to rise. If it starts to rise, there's still liquid in there, and you need to start recovering again after you let it rise. You want to let that liquid boil out, because if you do it and just go straight, full nut with it and let it recover, it's going to end up cracking a heat exchanger. You could do it on a condenser. I've seen it happen. You could also do it on a glycol chiller. You're very much less likely to do it on a glycol chiller, just for the fact that the glycol is rated to it freezes at -6, I think, right, Brett? 35% is a -6, and then it bursts at they have freeze point, and they have burst point. So there's I think it's negative. It's like 10 degrees, 15 degrees colder than the freeze point is the burst point. Is when you
I'd be absolutely lying if I told you yay or nay. I have no idea. I know what the freeze point is. I just don't know what the burst point is.
Off the top of my head, if I had to take a guess, I think it's -24. But so I mean, you just want to be very cautious of that while you're charging and while you're doing anything. If the pump shut off, you just want to be very cautious. You don't want to crack a heat exchanger, because let me tell you, one of those is not sitting on the shelf anywhere. You're going to have to get it from one of the OEMs. It's going to be a nightmare. And the piping, even if it's probably 2 months old, the piping's not going to match up. They change those things like no other, like all the time. So I've never changed one yet where the piping's the same.
Well, all you have to do is cut the heat exchanger in half and make it smaller, right?
Yeah.
No?
Yeah. So after, you get the rack charged up, you're going to want to make sure your flow's good, and then slowly open the liquid line, let the flow start going through there, and you want to watch and make sure your pressures look good. Now, mind you, as you're starting this up, your glycol pressure is going to drop as the glycol gets colder. So be very cautious of this. You're going to be adding more glycol no matter what. Even if your pressures are good before startup, you're going to be adding more glycol because as the glycol gets colder, it's going to become more dense and it's going to shrink. So it's going to shrink down and you're going to lose pressure. So you have to keep adding in there. Generally, I like to run my glycol if it's a 1-story building or underground. I usually run it about 18 to 24 pounds, on the return, and it usually gives you like 45 to 60 on the supply. I mean, that supply all depends on how much glycol pressure you have in there on the return, and then your foot of head, meaning your feet of how far you got to pump up. I mean, it's going to be less on a rack that's on the roof than it is on a rack that's on the ground. Or it depends. I mean, if it's in the basement, it's going to be even more.
Well,
So,
what you were saying before about the pressures on the expansion tank, didn't you say the one customer that you have that has the zero zone racks, those were supposed to be charged up to 60 pounds?
no, they're supposed to be charged about 22 pounds.
Oh, okay. For some odd reason, I thought you said 60.
When I had Oh no, it definitely said 60 on the tag on the tank, but that was not correct. Yeah, that was not correct at all. So, after you get everything started up, just watch it. You're gonna want to watch it, and you're gonna be bleeding. I mean, you're gonna be bleeding probably for a week, all little air pockets. But generally, once I get everything going and start doing that, I will generally go around to the cases once everything starts getting a little colder. And I'm going to start, purging air at the coils and making sure the coils are good. And then I will, before I do any of this, I will already have the circuits that are set. But I'm going to be honest with you, the last 5 stores I've started up that were glycol had no circuit setters in them.
The main heat exchangers?
No, none. So
why?
What
Because they're so good at designing that they can get the proper flow across that?
Because engineers are the best. Okay. So in the cases, they're using auto cartridges, which I like because nobody has to mess with them. But then I also hate them because you can't balance cases.
Oh, right.
So, I mean, I know this sounds kind of shitty, but like we've had times where I have to kind of close a return ball valve a little bit to try to balance a case. I mean, we've had cases where it's like, oh, it's 4 degrees different on this, and like the auto, everything, the flow's correct, everything looks good, the piping's good. It just is what it is. So I mean, there's a couple times where we've had to like throttle ball valve a smidge, just to kind of slow the flow down in the case. It was too cold, so the other case would be okay. I mean, they're nice because you don't really have that many problems. Sporlan actually makes a glycol CDS valve, which I've yet to see one in person, but to be honest, it looks pretty sweet.
Does it look like the CO2 valves? Like the H.
Yeah, it's got that big head on it. I mean, it would be great for case control, like way better than solenoids. But at the same time, like I don't know how much you'd be able to pinch down on it completely, because once you start pinching down too much, I would imagine it would affect the flow.
Yeah, well, yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, yeah, I see why a lot of engineers and system designers aren't using those, because, I mean, yeah, it is going to affect the flow. So, I mean, that's why, like, circuit setters, it's imperative to get them set, and you want to have a VFD on the pumps. I mean, unless you got the poor man's VFD with the supply to return bypass. Not a big fan of that setup, but you need some way to maintain the pump pressures and the return flow. Walmart didn't use any VFDs. They were just using end of line. They have end of line circuit setters that are set at a minimum GPM. But at Walmart, like, you shouldn't have more than like 2 cases shutting off at a time. If you have cases shutting off, your rack's running too cold. That goes for just about anybody. If you're cycling glycol solenoids nonstop, your rack's too cold. So you need to warm the rack up. I mean, the higher you keep the glycol's saturated suction or the saturated suction temperature in the rack and the glycol temp, the better the rack is going to run. So just keep that in mind. I mean, as you guys are, going through and doing stuff, you don't want, say the OEM calls for a 13-degree saturated suction temp for maintaining 18-degree glycol. I mean, 18-degree glycol is pretty cold. I mean, generally, most of the stuff with glycol is like a 4 or 5 degree TD. So you're talking cases that they're getting 18-degree glycol, they need 24-degree glycol. So that case is going to nonstop cycle.
Mm.
So you're better off just getting that glycol temp up a little higher to keep all the cases running, to keep everything more fluid and moving and not cycling. That the cycling is where you get your low alarms nonstop.
I'm thinking about how that valve would work. That that basically that glycol CDS valve.
It's his honor. It's going to start pinching down. So I mean, eventually it's going to, if you get too low. I mean, obviously it shouldn't have to pinch down that much
Yeah.
to to change the temperature. But I mean, eventually it's going to have to pinch down something.
Gotcha.
So now we're going to move on to actually, like, after you get everything started up and you balance it, you may have to tweak a circuit setter or two. So as you turn the circuit setter in to close it off, you're going to slow down glycol. When you slow down the glycol, it's going to pick up more heat. When you open the circuit setter, it's going to increase the flow, which is going to pick up less heat now because it's going faster through the coil. So it has less heat transfer. You could see this by throwing a temp probe on the inlet to the outlet of the coil. If you have too much flow, you're not going to be removing any heat. If you have too little flow, you're going to have a huge delta T from inlet to outlet temp. So that's one thing to keep in mind. You want to try to set your GPM as close to as possible. I know Brett had shown before with how to use that app, the HY Tech Tools app. Use the HY Tools app and get everything close. And then you kind of just tweak a little bit here and there, half turn, quarter turn, 3/4 a turn, to balance out cases with circuit setters. You want to try to balance the temps out, and then you want to keep them from cycling. If they're cycling, I mean, you may need to cut back on this or increase the flow a little bit on the circuit setters. If they're getting too cold, you increase the flow. It'll warm the cases up. It seems kind of backwards. You feed a coil more refrigerant, it usually gets colder. But in this case, it's going to pick up less heat from the air because the glycol is moving faster.
Those heat exchangers, typically those are set for what, like usually about 10 degrees of superheat.
It depends. I mean, yeah, usually 10. I mean, you usually don't have a long line set, so usually at 10 degrees, your rack's probably like at 18 degrees, especially if you don't have more circuits. Yeah,
and usually it's 5 to 7 degree TD, right?
Some of them are less than that. The last one I did was like 3.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, brace plate heat exchangers have gotten 10 times more efficient.
Ooh.
So, I mean, they've gotten way more efficient. So the other thing I want to talk about, we've had this situation come up quite a bit here lately. At the last 5 stores I've been involved with. So Zero Zone, I won't mention the customer, but Zero Zone has had a giant rash of warm fluid heat exchangers crack.
Oh no!
I know of at least 14 stores where this has happened. So
and this is all across the country too. There's ones
all across the country, and this is not this is across the last couple of years. This has been going on. So it's not like a brand new heat exchanger issue. It's not a Rona shitty manufacturing issue. This is a Zero Zone issue. So they are cracking heat exchangers. I've only heard of one heat exchanger on the glycol cracking, but every one of them has been the warm fluid. So the warm fluid heat exchanger is cracking, and what it's doing is if this customer, all the vents in the store should be off. It starts out like this. Service guy gets a call out there, random leak detection alarm in the rack room. So they get a random leak detection alarm in a rack room. They go out there and they can't really find anything, yada, yada, yada. Guy writes up the leak detector, yada, 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 leaves. Okay, another call, leak detection. They think it's a leak detector. They get that fixed. They put a leak detector in. It still doesn't fix it. Another call, leak detection. It's usually the third call that somebody in there starts finding it, because by then it starts getting worse. So what's happening is it's bleeding through the auto vent that bleeds into the glycol tank. It's purging out refrigerant. Did air conditioners turn on?
No, I don't know what that was.
Yeah. So it bleeds through the auto vent. It bleeds refrigerant through. Okay. Then it sets a leak detector off. That's like on the edge of the rack. So then it sets a leak detector off nonstop. So then fast forward a little bit more. Now the glycol stops working randomly. And what happens is it's not cooling. You have shitty flow. Your pump pressures are all messed up. You'll see your pumps pegged out, like the bypass. It'll be like wide open or wide or shut. You'll have super high return pressure, super high supply pressure. Nothing be feeding. You have really poor heat transfer, because this is what's going to happen is once it ruptures and starts pouring refrigerant in there, where's that refrigerant going to sit? It's going to sit inside of the heat exchanger. So it's going to sit inside the heat exchanger, and it's going to block all the flow. So it's going to condense inside the heat exchanger, and it's going to block the glycol flow. And once that happens, it's going to stop heat transfer. And then all of a sudden, it's going to, obviously you're going to be there. You're going to have poor heat transfer, this and that. What I usually have the guys do is I'll have them, by that silcock where you can drain the glycol when you're doing the power purge. I'll have them crack that. And with their leak detector, usually the Stratus will start just climbing, and they'll usually peg. I mean, at that point, valve off the warm fluid heat exchanger, the glycol to it. Why you do this, purge it down, then start purging the glycol, let it warm up, start purging the glycol, get all the refrigerant out, and then start this thing back up. Now, your warm fluid heat exchanger, while you're letting it sit and drain, and let it see if it builds up pressure. And if it does, the thing's toast. Just leave it off, and then you have to convert everything to off time defrost. You're gonna extend all your defrost out to be off time defrost from now on until you get a heat exchanger. So they're claiming it's liquid hammer. They're claiming it's it's thermal shock. I don't buy it, because it's most of the time with that customer, there's something in defrost almost all the time.
See, I have my theory about that.
What's your theory?
Well, if it's not calling for heat, or if it's not calling to heat that glycol up for the warm fluid, right? Basically, that discharge pressure is basically going to sit in there, right? And at one point, it's going to condense, and then as soon as it starts calling for, the hot gas to fill it up again, I think it might be expanding rapidly and then rupturing the thing.
Then why does Hill Phoenix not have the same problem?
Do they have a bleed on theirs?
Nope.
They don't.
Nope. I have Hill Phoenix ones that are, anywhere from 2 years to 15 years old. We've never had a warm fluid heat exchanger crack. I mean, we've moved them above the racks. They've had us move them so they free drain. They put this check valve in that I considered does nothing. It's a check valve to nowhere usually, to try to keep it from pushing too much pressure through it. They had them before where they were way oversized. They were condensing liquid during the warm fluid. They were condensing liquid refrigerant in there when they weren't supposed to. I mean, it was dropping a drop the line leaving the warm fluid heat exchanger was 30 degrees. to 30 to 35 degrees on the original stores, and they were nonstop condensing. Like it would eat up like 100 pounds of gas out of the receiver in no time.
Wow.
I just think it's the way they designed it and the way it's done. I mean, you could put a pump out in it, but I mean, I still think the shock. I mean, there's something in defrost all the time. I mean, there's maybe half an hour to an hour where there's something not in warm fluid.
What's it controlling the temp? Like, what's it trying to get the glycol up to?
60 degrees.
So, I mean, it's not like it's on all the time, right? It's only on when you have something in defrost, correct?
It's only on when there's something in defrost. There's only refrigerant flow to it when there's something in defrost, and there's only glycol flow to it when there's something in defrost.
And you don't pump it out, right? You just basically turn off a 3-way valve to it to
No, an automated ball valve.
Okay. So that's what I'm saying, though. Like, if it just sits there and basically that refrigerant condenses, and then you shoot it with a brush of, hot gas, it's going to boil off that liquid refrigerant violently. I mean, if anyone's ever seen liquid refrigerant in an oil separator or an oil reservoir and, shot hot gas to it, and, you'll see it rapidly just, bubble up. Imagine how close those braze plates are. They're teeny close. The clearance on it isn't that much. So if you get that rapid expansion, you don't think that could potentially cause it to do that?
I mean, I guess it could.
I got an idea. Take one of those stores, put a pump out on it, and see if it ever goes bad.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never seen the Hill Phoenix one crack.
Zero Zone, did you figure it out yet? Let us know. Okay.
But yeah, like that's one thing to be, just be aware of for, if you're doing these glycol startups and you do have like odd pump pressures and stuff like that, just be aware of that stuff, because you could have a one rupture, a warm fluid heat exchanger tank rupture, a chiller leaking. What?
Nothing. I thought it was a funny joke.
I'm far too tired to deal with you today.
Oh no! Tell me more about the exchanger, Tyson.
Oh, you're such a dick.
Come on, tell me about the heat exchanger.
It's 2022. You can't say things like that.
What? A famous boxer impression? Can't do that?
Ugh. All right, guys. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up on the glycol startup and issues. Thanks for listening, guys, and have a nice night.
Later, guys.
What the hell? No.
¿Dónde está la biblioteca? Me llamo T-Bone, la araña discoteca.
Discoteca, muñeca, la biblioteca. Es el bigote grande, pero manteca.
Manteca, bigote, gigante, pequeño. Cabeza es nieve, cerveza es bueno.
Buenos días, me gustas papas frías. Bigote de la cabra, de Cameron Díaz. Yeah, boy.
Yeah.
What? It's 2009.
Word.